A Game of Solitaire, written by C. Scott Marcano. Preface. My name is Desmond Anthony Marino, but you, gentle reader, can call me Des, as my friends do. Before I begin, I'd like to preface things with a few small comments. What I'm about to tell you is a true story. In recounting this twisted saga, I'm afraid that I must bring to light certain unsettling secrets that my family has kept hidden away for many, many years. To those of my lineage whom I offend in speaking of these private, painful things, I apologize deeply in advance. My intention is not to bring shame upon us or gouge open old wounds. Rather, my aim in recounting these strange, sometimes absurdly funny, but often terrible, disturbing events is to find some viable meaning in it all and perhaps provide a measure of solace. The story I'm about to tell is tragic, but it's also, well, perhaps I shouldn't foreshadow too much beyond saying it concerns the lives of two young men. Both of us lived in a world deeply divided by race and culture. Our journeys were very similar, but also distinctly different. We were tied together by blood, but separated by a vast ocean, and yet our stories impacted one another in ways both great and small that neither of us could ever have foreseen. Some of you hearing these parallel tales for the first time might find some of these events frankly hard to believe. You might be prone to question my veracity, as many once did, thinking I'm exaggerating, half crazy, or just making this up to get your attention. However, let me assure you, gentle reader, that everything I'm about to tell you is 100% true, or at least, it's my truth. Chapter 1. The House. 1 a.m., somewhere east of San Diego. What the hell am I doing? I wondered aloud to myself as I drove slowly through the circuitous dark streets of the unfamiliar suburban neighborhood. The question was rhetorical, as I knew perfectly well the reason I'd come creeping around the affluent but isolated community in the middle of the night. The real point of my query was much deeper and more penetrating than the immediate particulars of what I was searching for that night. What I was truly asking was, have I lost my sanity? The question had been raised a lot lately, not just by me, but by several people in my life who had seen the steady deterioration of my emotional health in the last 2 years. Many friends and family told me I had become hopelessly obsessive, paranoid, delusional, and was possibly even suffering from an undiagnosed case of schizophrenia. At the very least, the consensus was that I needed serious professional help. Although I routinely brushed off these dire concerns, insisting that I was perfectly fine, privately, I feared they might be right. Maybe I'm crazy, I muttered to myself as I reached for my phone to check my location on the GPS app and make sure I was heading in the right direction. If I don't stop this wannabe private eye bullshit, I'll probably end up just like her, either crazy or dead, or both. As I lifted up my phone to check the GPS app again, I discovered, to my horror, that it had run out of battery power and gone completely dead. That's just fucking great, I hissed angrily, totally disgusted with myself. Here I was, trying to be so clever, and I wasn't even smart enough to charge my damn phone before leaving my apartment back in LA. Now I was completely screwed. I tossed the useless phone on the passenger seat and stopped the car. Ahead of me was a T intersection. I glanced up at a street sign on the corner. The road was called Deer Trail Lane. I didn't recall seeing it on the digital map before my phone died. I buried my face in my hands for a moment and almost broke down into sobs. I was lost, not just in the dark environs of this maze-like neighborhood I was meandering through, but in life. I sat there for a long time on the deserted road, idling the engine of my beat-up Chevette, as loathing and depression washed over me like a black wave. I wanted to leave, to go back to my nice, safe apartment in Hollywood, crawl into bed and call it a night. But somehow I couldn't summon the strength to do even that simple task. Instead, I just sat there, paralyzed with indecision and despair, a familiar fugue state that had persisted within me for the last 6 months. The place I was stuck in was called Spring Valley. It was a bedroom community that lay on the extreme outskirts of San Diego. It was an affluent but semi-rural place, tucked into the foothills east of the city. Because of the distance, the commute to San Diego was brutal, so not many people chose to live out here. Most of the homes were scattered here and there. Many residences had horse corrals and stables. The resemblance to another place I knew very well was unsettling. It reminded me of home. Malibu. I had come here looking for an address I dug up during the course of my so-called investigation. The first time I'd seen it, the address had appeared on a police report. I'd unearthed it in my spare time working as a private investigator back in LA. This had led me to the Hall of Records in San Diego, where I discovered that the property had a home built on it that was owned by my enigmatic Danish grandmother, Inga. It made no sense. When my grandmother had gotten back in touch with me several months prior, asking for help to fill out her Medicare application, I found her living in a small apartment in Escondido. I asked her on several occasions where she had been during the 2 years since my mother had died and we had stopped speaking to each other, but she had been vague on the details. Our falling out had been extremely bitter. After my mother had unexpectedly died, my grandmother had suddenly produced a last will and testament that made her the sole beneficiary of my mother's entire estate. According to the will, my brother, Derek, and I were to receive $1 each. It was the final middle finger to us. My mother had cut us off. When I tried to ask questions about how much money my mother had when she died and why she'd suddenly written us out of the will, my grandmother abruptly ended all direct contact with us. The next thing I knew, she had hired a lawyer who started sending me threatening letters. He demanded that I hand over immediately any financial papers that were in my possession, because my grandmother was not only the sole beneficiary, but the executor of my mother's will. I was deeply hurt by all this, as you might imagine, but I complied and sent over all the papers I had. It wasn't much, just some old gas and telephone bills I'd found lying on her desk the night her body had been found, and I'd been summoned by grandmother to comfort her at their home in Brawley. I could have hired a lawyer to contest the will, but frankly, I didn't have it in me at that point. The last few years had been a living nightmare trying to save my mother from the black hole I saw her getting sucked into bit by bit. The crusade to save her life had been an exhausting struggle that ended in bitter, heartbreaking defeat. Did something smell rotten in all this? Sure. But I had no fight left in me. I was too drained by the tragedy of it all. Despite my grandmother's insulting claims, I wasn't interested in getting an inheritance. I had money at the time. My first studio film had just come out. All I wanted was my mother back. Short of that, I just wanted some answers. I kept asking what really happened in the days prior to her death. Why did so much time go by after she disappeared before anyone reached out to us? It made no sense. But my grandmother was silent as a tomb on this subject. Her lawyer told me curtly in his last letter to move on and get lost. A month later, I was sent a cardboard box that had only the return address of a funeral parlor written on it. Inside, it contained a third of my mother's ashes, stuffed into a plastic bag. That was all that was left of my mom. I didn't hear from my grandmother again for 2 years. I was sitting in my apartment in Hollywood writing, when out of the blue, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but curious, I answered it anyway. "Hello? Who's this?" I queried, thinking it was probably a telemarketer. But to my shock, a familiar, heavily accented voice responded on the other end of the line. "Hello, darling. It's me, Granny." I was stunned. Hi, Granny," I replied awkwardly. I had no idea how she'd gotten my number since it wasn't listed. She began chatting with me amicably, asking how I was doing, what I was up to these days, etc. Granny sounded sweet as a Danish pastry. No pun intended. She acted as if nothing had ever happened between us. After a bit of small talk, she said she had called because she'd thought things over and wanted to reconcile with my brother and me. When I questioned her about what she had been up to since we last spoke, she was vague about many of the details. It was difficult to understand her too because of her thick Danish accent, which had become even more pronounced since I'd last spoken to her. She claimed that after she had paid out funeral expenses, there was no more money left in my mother's estate, which seemed a little dubious considering that there was no funeral and that she had fought like crazy to secure control over her supposedly insolvent finances. But I didn't press her on it. Granny said She had sold the small house my mother owned in Brawley and moved into her current apartment in Escondido, where she got by on the meager monthly checks from my late grandfather's pension. According to her, while biding her time in Escondido, by chance, she had met a group of Danish expats at a church she attended who had befriended her. She even claimed that one of them, a man named Hans, was now her boyfriend. "I am in love," she exclaimed in a very excited voice. I told her that I was happy for her, but I had some questions. Specifically, I wanted to know what happened to him, my mother's last husband, Chip, the man I suspected might have been responsible for her death. "Chip left," she said cheerily. "Left? Where'd he go?" I asked. "To Alabama, I think. I've not seen him in 2 years. My grandmother went on to explain that Chip had gone back to the small southern town he grew up in, where he had met my mother shortly after the funeral. She insisted that she had no idea what he was doing these days. Then she quickly switched gears and started making small talk about old times we had together when I was a kid, saying how much she missed me and my brother. She said she desperately wanted to heal the wounds between us. I told her I would make plans to come down for lunch soon, even though I wasn't at all sure if I intended to follow through. As we ended the call, she suddenly became emotional. "I love you," she blurted out. "I love you too, Granny," I replied sincerely and ended the call. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, debating what to do. Later that day, I called my brother Derek and my father, Arthur, and told them both what had happened. My brother was surprisingly even-tempered about the whole thing. He had a notorious fierce temper, and he ranted nonstop the last 2 years that our grandmother was either involved in our mother's death, or short of that, was basically a mean-ass bitch who had betrayed us, choosing to side with Chip, an alcoholic who had ruined our mother's life over her own flesh and blood. Now he was suddenly ready to let bygones be bygones. He insisted it was our sacred duty to help Granny out if she was reaching out to us. "We owe it to Mom," he insisted. "She'd want us to do the right thing. Go have lunch with her, bro. See what's up. What's the worst that can happen?" My father, however, was far less sanguine. "It's your life," he said firmly, his voice sounding deadly serious in his deep, melodious Trinidadian accent. "But I'm telling you, father to son, don't go anywhere near that bitch. Trust me, there's a lot you don't know about her." "Like what?" I asked, intrigued. I had never heard my father sound so angry and emotional discussing my grandmother before. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't want to get into it," he finally replied. "It's a long story. Let's just say you don't really know her." He ended the call on that cryptic note, without explaining anything further. I was caught between a rock and a hard place now. I deeply respected my father's advice. He would not tell me not to do something unless he really meant it, but it was hard to ignore my duty to my mother's memory. My brother Derek did have a point, despite everything that had happened, and my lingering questions regarding my mother's untimely death. Inga was still my grandmother. She was a frail woman, almost 90 years old, and she needed my help. Sitting in my car at the T intersection now, many months later, the consequences of that ill-fated decision weighed heavily on my mind. How different would my circumstances be if I had simply followed my father's advice and said no? Would things have turned out better for me? Would so many of my close relationships not be in shambles? I was trapped in a confusing and unsettling situation that was tearing me up inside and was driving me to a nervous breakdown. But there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. Not in this world, anyway. I could not bring my dead mother back to life any more than I could save her when she was still breathing. It served no purpose to wallow in self-pity and despair. I needed to snap out of my inertia and deal with the situation at hand. Looking up again at the crossroad, I realized I had two obvious choices: turn right and head back in the direction of the freeway. Turning left would lead me deeper into the strange neighborhood. It was also symbolic and strange. The universe was giving me a choice. I stared at the intersection for several minutes, which seemed to tick by like hours. Finally, I put the car in gear and turned left. I drove around aimlessly through the dark, empty streets for a while, searching for the street listed on the police report. And then, after I made a random turn onto a dead-end street, suddenly there it was. The address was stenciled on the curb in front of a lone mailbox. There were no other houses on the block. In fact, I could see no home that belonged to the address. There was just the mailbox. Beyond that was a long, winding driveway that led off into the dark hills. This was a problem. I had assumed the house would be right off the street. My plan had been to just drive by and see what the home looked like. That would tell me a lot about my grandmother's real circumstances. Maybe if I was lucky, I'd be able to peek through a window and see someone inside. That way I could confirm if Granny was actually living in it, or worse, if Chip was still lurking about. However, if I drove down the driveway, surely someone would hear the car. They'd see me, and my attempt at spying would be instantly discovered. They would lead to who knows what. My only real option was to get out of my car, walk down the driveway, and sneak up on the house in the darkness. Christ, I thought to myself, if this wasn't like a bad episode of the Rockford Files. Grudgingly, I pulled my car over to the side of the road and parked it discreetly in the shadows underneath a row of eucalyptus trees. I got out and quietly shut the door. I began walking slowly down the gloomy, meandering driveway. It was so dark that I could barely see my hand in front of my face. This was a small blessing. No one could see me unless they had a flashlight trained directly on me. At least I had that going for me. There was no sound except for the small, muffled crunch of my Chuck Taylor sneakers made as they scraped along the asphalt. Suddenly, there was a loud, wailing cry directly to my right that made me jump right out of my skin. It sounded like a woman shrieking. It took me a second to realize it was just a coyote, making one of their awful, high-pitched howls as they tore a small animal to pieces. I cursed silently to myself and continued stumbling along down the road again. My adrenaline was really pumping now. Again, the question pounded in my skull. What the hell am I doing? I was alone, unarmed, without a phone, in the middle of nowhere, creeping up on a house where a suspected murderer might be living. Was I crazy? Probably. But still, I pressed on. I can't really explain why, but I was determined to see this thing through to the bitter end. The driveway seemed to go on forever. Finally, after stumbling along in the dark for roughly 10 minutes, a faint glow began to appear around a bend in the road ahead of me. I crouched as low as I could and slowly turned the corner. And there it was, the house. It was a large 2-story structure painted bright white. It almost looked brand new. I was shocked by the size of the home. It was much, much bigger than my mom's modest dwelling in Brawley. Heck, it was bigger than the house I grew up in Malibu. It had at least 3 bedrooms. My guts churned. Granny owned this house. She had bought it with the money from Mom's estate. Her claims of being almost broke and the estate being insolvent were complete lies. What else was she lying to me about? There were no cars in the driveway, but the home was lit up like a Christmas tree by dozens of super bright exterior floodlights. It appeared that lights were on inside the home as well. I squatted down in the shadows and studied the windows intently, looking for movement, but saw nothing. Keeping my eyes trained on the windows of the house, I moved quickly down the driveway and walked into the light. I was out of the safety of the shadows now, completely exposed. If someone came to a window, my only escape would be to run as quickly as I could back down the dark road. I got as close to the house as I could, crouched down again, and listened intently. I did not hear any sounds coming from inside. I cupped my ear, held my breath. Total silence. There was not a security camera anywhere in sight, so I felt confident I wasn't being detected. Growing bolder, I slinked my way up to the front door, which had a rectangular paned glass window just to the right side of it. I squatted down low in front of the window and peered inside. I saw a large entryway with a high ceiling and beautifully tiled floor. There was an ornate hanging light fixture above a roundish patterned rug near the front door and a staircase that led up to the second floor. To the left of the staircase was a nicely furnished living room with a pool table and a dining room just beneath that. A bright standing lamp, standing aside the pool table, provided the only illumination for the front rooms. The entire upstairs area was opaque with gloom. The rooms beyond the ones I could see on the first floor were dark as well. It then dawned on me that most likely no one was home. The outside lights and standing lamp in the pool room had been left on, merely to give the appearance that someone was home. I could test my theory out by ringing the doorbell, but my better judgment decided against it. I had pushed my luck far enough for one evening. I had proved to myself that my grandmother was lying about her income. That was enough of a revelation for the moment. I could always come back and spy again, I reasoned. It was time to bounce while the bouncing was good. I was about to turn to leave when suddenly I heard a low, mechanical growling sound behind me. In an instant, a pair of bright lights hit the front of the house, casting a large, distorted shadow of my body frame against the front door. I spun around in a panic and saw a pair of headlights coming towards me down the long driveway. "Fuck!" my mind screamed. "Run for it!" But the car was upon me instantly, cutting off my escape back up the driveway. I thought about dashing away from the house and hiding in the nearby hills. But before I could move, the car high beams went on, lighting me up like a prison guard tower spotlight hitting a fleeing conflict. They had seen me. It was Chip. Maybe alone or with my grandmother. I was certain of it. Shit! I cursed under my breath. My legs suddenly felt weak. My knees almost buckled beneath me. I took a breath and steadied myself. I tried to think clearly. Yes, they had caught me red-handed spying on their secret house. The question was, what would they do about it? What would they really say, after all? Yes, I shouldn't be here trespassing, but they shouldn't own this house to begin with. I wondered what devious thoughts were running through their heads right now. Were they going to try and explain this situation away? Or would they become aggressive? I had no fear of my grandmother, at least physically. However, if my suspicions about Chip were correct, then I would have a lot to worry about. He could be armed. I'd seen his guns. He liked to show them off and brag about what a great shot he was. He claimed to always keep at least one with him. If he shot me and threw my body into the trunk of his car, who would know? The car glided into the end of the driveway and slowed to a stop a few yards shy of my position at the front door. The driver turned off the engine but did not get out. Instead, he just sat there in silence while keeping the headlights trained on me, trapped like a skittering cockroach with nowhere to run. Blinded by the car's high beams, I could not see a thing. I shielded my eyes with my right hand and tried to peer through the radiance. I was able to faintly make out the dim silhouette of a large man sitting behind the steering wheel, staring directly at me. The passenger seat was empty. Chip was alone, which was even more frightening. Suddenly, I heard a click. The driver's side door swung slowly open. A shoe made a small, scuffing sound as the driver stepped onto the pavement. Through the glare of the headlights, I could vaguely make out the man's looming form as he squared off in front of me in a menacingly posture. In my mind, I said a small, silent prayer.